Okay, so welcome everyone. You might be thinking, today's deep dive is going to be some cutting edge tech or the latest market disruption.
Right.
But actually, we're digging into something that feels, well, surprisingly relevant, maybe even kind of fundamental, especially in startups and innovation. We're talking about earnestness.
Earnestness. Yeah, it sounds a bit old-fashioned, doesn't it?
It really does. But we've got some
Yeah.
fascinating insights here, sources coming from Jessica and someone else who really spends their time evaluating startup founders.
Hmm.
So our mission, let's say, for this dive is to figure out why these sources see earnestness as like this super valuable, almost unstoppable trait in certain fields.
And what that might actually mean you know, for you, for the listener, and whatever you happen to be working on.
Exactly.
It's interesting because, like you said, earnestness might make you think of, I don't know, Victorian novels or something.
Yeah, totally. Characters who are maybe a bit too sincere.
Right, maybe naive, but what these sources argue is this isn't some dusty old concept. It's actually vital for hitting it big, especially in the whole startup game.
Okay, so let's pin this down then. When we say earnestness here,
Mm.
in this context, what exactly are we talking about?
Well, the sources frame it really clearly, I think. It basically comes down to two things.
Oh.
One, doing something for the right reasons, and two, just trying as absolutely hard as you possibly can.
Right, so motive and effort.
Exactly. It's like you've got direction, the motive, and then magnitude, the effort. And for real earnestness, those have to line up.
And they seem to feed each other too, don't they? The sources kind
Yeah.
of suggest that if the reasons are right, the huge effort just happens.
And more naturally, anyway, if you're genuinely curious about the problem or you really, really want to find that solution, you're just inherently going to pour more energy into it.
Right.
It's less like you have to force yourself and more like you kind of want to.
Okay, now the sources mention something specific about Silicon Valley here, about wrong motives for starting a company. What do they mean by wrong?
Yeah, that's a key point. They highlight that, look, wanting wealth and fame, that's a big motivator for a lot of founders.
Sure, obviously.
And there's nothing, morally wrong with that. But the argument is those motives just aren't as effective long term. Not compared to having a real deep interest in the actual problem you're solving, that intrinsic thing. That's the core of this valuable earnestness they're talking about.
So wrong isn't unethical. It's just less likely to work out when things get tough in innovation.
Yeah.
That's a useful distinction. Changes how you see it.
Absolutely. And this connects really nicely to the whole idea of being a nerd, which the sources also bring up.
Right. How so?
Well, it's that same thing, isn't it? Being fascinated by something just for what it is, not because it's trendy or because of the external rewards, but just the thing itself.
Yeah, that willingness to maybe not care about being cool if it means you can really dive into something you find genuinely interesting.
Hmm. The sources even talk about sacrificing coolness for that interest.
Like a badge of honor, almost, in this context.
Sort of, because that genuine interest, they argue, it's just this incredibly powerful engine. Maybe, for some people, the most powerful driver there is.
And that's what investors or people evaluating founders are looking for.
That's exactly what they're saying. They're actively seeking that quality out.
Makes sense. I mean, when you hit the inevitable roadblocks, that deep interest is probably what keeps you plugging away when the dream of a big payout starts to fade a bit.
That's the idea.
Hmm.
But the sources also mention a potential downside, especially earlier on.
Yeah.
Yeah, a sort of vulnerability that can come with being earnest.
Right, I saw that. Like finding it hard to be cynical, not quite fitting in with the detached, world-weary attitude.
Exactly that. If you genuinely care, it can be harder to, do the sarcastic banter or keep up that cool, unflappable front. But here's the twist they point out. That thing that looks like a weakness early on, it can actually become a huge advantage later.
Okay, so this is the nerds inheriting the earth kind of thing. Or, well, becoming the bosses anyway.
Sort of, yeah. They're saying it's not just about being smart. That underlying earnestness becomes really critical when you start tackling the truly complex, messy problems.
Ah, yeah.
Because once you get past the surface level stuff, that deep care, that unwavering commitment, that becomes absolutely essential. And that's where the earnest folks, the ones driven by interest all along, really start to shine.
So their earnestness becomes like a superpower.
That's a good way to put it, yeah.
Interesting how that value shifts.
Yeah.
So if it's so powerful in some areas, where does it maybe matter less, according to these sources?
Well, they give a pretty thought-provoking list, and maybe a bit surprising.
Lay it on me.
Politics, crime, Certain kinds of business like gambling, personal injury law, patent trolling,
Yeah.
maybe even some corners of academia and humor.
Huh. That's a
Yep.
real mix. What's the common thread there? What pattern are they seeing?
They suggest a kind of heuristic, a rule of thumb for choosing your field. Ask yourself, how much does earnestness really matter here?
Okay.
And one way to gauge that, they suggest, is to look at the top. How many people do you see who are clearly driven by that deep intrinsic interest, the nerds we talked about?
All right.
If you don't see many, it might mean earnestness isn't the main currency for success in that particular game.
That's actually a really practical way to think about it. Like,
Yep.
is genuine care and hard work the main way people get ahead here, or is it something else?
Exactly. Now, another angle they explore is why earnestness often gets linked with being naive.
Yeah, why is that?
Yeah.
People who are earnest can sometimes seem a bit unaware, innocent.
The idea is maybe it's because they don't fully get, or maybe they just forget, the less genuine motives that drive other people.
Because those motives don't really click with them personally.
Right, so they might just not spot them as easily in others, like a blind spot for insincerity, maybe. But this perceived naivete isn't always a negative. They talk about naive optimism.
Okay, what's that?
It can actually be really powerful when you're facing stuff that seems impossible. If you don't fully appreciate just how hard something is supposed to be.
You might just try it anyway.
Exactly. You tackle it with this unburdened enthusiasm that might actually lead to a breakthrough.
That how hard can it be
Yeah.
attitude. I can see that. You bypass the cynicism that stops others.
Right. It avoids that premature dismissal. It's fascinating, too, considering the history of the word earnest.
Oh, yeah.
The sources mention it's had a bit of a complicated run, especially in intellectual circles, since Oscar Wilde. Being earnest wasn't always seen as terribly sophisticated.
Right. The importance of being earnest and all that irony. So there's historical baggage.
Definitely. Which makes it kind of paradoxical, doesn't it? That this quality, maybe looked down on by some intellectuals, is supposedly so valued in Silicon Valley.
Yeah, a place often seen as hyper-ambitious and, let's face it, focused on making tons of money.
That's the exact tension they dig into. They tackle the skepticism you hear when founders say, oh, we just want to make the world a better place.
Right, especially when there are huge potential payoffs involved.
Mm-hmm.
Is it real or just good PR?
And the sources kind of land on?
Well, yeah, some might be insincere, but they argue a lot of founders actually are genuinely fascinated by the problem itself. They even ask, why is it so hard to believe someone could be genuinely obsessed with, say, self-driving cars or building new ways for people to connect online?
That's a fair point. We accept deep passion in science or art.
Exactly.
Right.
We don't doubt someone can be passionate about astrophysics or history. So why is it weird to think someone could be just as fired up about technological innovation?
Yeah.
And as they point out, in pretty much every other field, that deep interest provides the energy, the resilience. Why would business, especially modern tech business, be different?
Which kind of leads into their explanation for why we might have this blind spot about earnestness in business. What's their thinking there? It goes back to history, really. For a long time, the path to making serious money wasn't always linked with super intellectually engaging work.
Okay.
The sources suggest, maybe a bit controversially, that some older forms of business weren't always that far removed from activities that weren't viewed entirely positively. Less about creation, perhaps.
But things have changed drastically. They mentioned Henry Ford as an early example, right? Someone tackling big, interesting technical problems within a business context.
Yes, and they stress that this trend has just massively accelerated.
Right.
The alignment between genuine intellectual curiosity and the potential for big financial success, that's a key part of what startups represent now.
So it's much more possible today to get rich by working on something you find truly fascinating than it used to be.
That seems to be the argument, and that very alignment, where deep interest meets potential reward.
That's probably a huge driver of the innovation speed we see. It's not just the money, it's the passion fueling the progress.
Precisely. The sources really push us to think about that convergence. Can you think of a bigger shift, they ask, than when deep intellectual curiosity and the drive for worldly success start pulling in the same direction?
Powerful forces aligning.
Two incredibly powerful forces, and seeing them line up more and more, it's pretty significant.
So wrapping this up, maybe for you, the listener, you might look at the startup world, all the speed, the money, the hype. But what these sources suggest is that underneath a lot of that, there's this surprisingly strong current of something seemingly quite old-fashioned. Earnestness.
That mix of really truly caring about the problem and then just pouring everything you have into solving it.
Yeah.
Which leads to a final thought, maybe to something to mull over. Think about genuine interest in your own life, your work, your passions.
Okay.
Where could leaning into that earnestness, the right reasons plus maximum effort, where could that lead to something unexpected, something really meaningful for you?
Hmm. Thinking about the connection between what really sparks your curiosity and what you actually spend your time pursuing.
Exactly. You might just be surprised what that kind of simple, heartfelt dedication can actually unlock.